and welcome to Autism in Conversation with Auticon, a new podcast from Auticon, a global IT consultancy whose consultants are all autistic. This brand new series is designed to help raise awareness of what it means to be autistic through fascinating conversations. Hosted by me, Carrie Grant, each episode will feature interviews with leading voices on autism, including figures from the business world, autistic social media influencers, and autism academics alike. We'll be talking about the many benefits of hiring neurodiverse talent, through to some of the more common challenges faced by autistic adults navigating the workplace. All my 4 children are neurodivergent, so this is a subject very close to my heart. I'm really looking forward to facilitating some great conversations about autism and hopefully learning some new things along the way. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the latest Autism in Conversation with Auticon. In this episode, we'll be talking about the staggering statistic that only around 1 in 5 autistic adults is in employment. This figure makes grim reading, especially as many neurodivergent individuals often possess significant skills and talents, which can be highly sought after in the working world. So why the disconnect? During the discussion today, the panel and I will look at the most common issues that are hindering employment amongst autistic people, as well as ways to tackle the problem. Joining me today are Dan Jones, founder of the Aspie World, Steve Hill, the commercial director at Auticon UK, Tim Nichols, head of policy at the National Autistic Society, and Peter Wharmby, autistic speaker, writer, tutor and parent. Welcome, everyone. So, Tim, give us a sense of the landscape. What can you tell us about the current employment situation for autistic adults?
Well, Carrie, I think your introduction said it all, really. We're in a situation where the latest data from the ONS, so government data, suggests that just 22% of autistic people might be in any kind of work at all. Now, that is the first lot of that data, and actually we've been campaigning for years to get to a point where that has actually been published. So that's a good step along the way. And it may be that subsequent data is a bit more refined, might show something slightly different. But it's also completely consistent with surveys that the National Autistic Society has run of its own, which suggested that there was a massive autism employment gap. And not only just that autistic people are struggling to find work, it's that when autistic people are in work, around 4 in 10, when we asked them a few years ago, told us they feel underemployed. So they're not working the number of hours that they'd like to work, or they're not working at the level that they'd like to work. They feel like it should be more senior. So there's lots of things to unpack here, because it's not as simple as either being in a job or not being in a job. It can be about not reaching your potential because of all the barriers in the way, because employers might not understand autism or any number of other things. What we also know is that although not all autistic people will be able to work, so my older brother is autistic, he has very complex needs, he can't really speak, he needs to be in a supported placement, he's not going to be able to hold down a day-to-day job. But around 3/4 of autistic people who did respond to our survey a few years ago told us that they desperately wanted a job. So there's a big mismatch there between a huge pool of willing talent needing to be tapped into and the situation that we're in currently, where actually that's just not happening.
So I hear what you're saying there. You're saying there's few people being employed, and then actually at lower levels compared with the skill set that they may have. So there's, like you said, there's a lot of unpacking to do there. Steve, what are some of those skills that can be more prevalent in autistic people, and how are they beneficial in the workplace? Let's try and switch this up a bit and get employers to think about, actually, this is an advantage. This is not me helping someone out. This is actually going to be of benefit to me.
Exactly, Karen. I think, from our perspective, some of the qualities that autistic people have, particularly in the IT sector in which we operate, are things like error detection, logical analysis, sustained concentration, pattern matching. So again, when you think about the IT sector, and particularly in cybersecurity and all things data related, so data analysis and machine learning. Those types of skills are invaluable. And actually, from a commercial perspective, there is a massive shortage of skills generally in that sector. And that's not just a UK issue. That's globally, because obviously the rise of AI, machine learning, and the prevalence of data and the amount of data that's produced on a daily basis, it's fueling that part of the industry. And so for us, it's really about taking the skills which aren't necessarily well known about in business and really making that connection.
It's so interesting that you touch on IT there. I would feel like in my industry of the arts, so many of the creatives that I work with, they may not be diagnosed, but there's definitely a lot of autism going on in the creative industries. There's some of the most creative people because they think outside of the box, and that can produce incredible art. So what are the things that are concerning autistic people in the workplace? What are the challenges and the barriers?
So we recently conducted some of our own research, Carrie, because this is something that we were quite keen to get a litmus test on, really. And I guess you could break these into three main areas. The first one is really what we would term reasonable adjustments. So in practical terms, they're very straightforward things to be able to address. So things like bright lighting, concerns around being in an open plan office, having to navigate some of the unwritten rules of the workplace itself. So things like small talk and, work social events and those sort of things. And also processes and procedures not being followed. So whilst those are quite heavy in terms of the statistics, so across all of those things, we're ranging between sort of 35 and 40%. I think ultimately these are things that are easily taken care of with that awareness and training and with a better appreciation of autism in the workplace. I think the second area is, and arguably this is the biggest stat, this is around the worries of autistic people being able to communicate their mental health in the workplace. And so, in the people that we surveyed, 49% particularly were across the board really worried about how they would actually approach that with their management. And actually what was really scary, if you break that down even more, 62% in ages 18 to 30 were very worried as well, which shows obviously that younger people just don't feel able in the workplace to be able to have that conversation with their line management around the state of their mental health.
And part of that, I guess, is self-advocacy, isn't it? It's very hard. I notice with my two children, they do struggle with having to advocate for themselves. I feel like throughout school, it's like parent comes in and advocates for that child. And it's very hard for many autistic people to feel like, am I allowed to say this? What am I allowed to say? How do I say it? What if I get it wrong? I think all of those things are difficult. And when it's a subject, this isn't just like, where do I sit? This is subjects like, how do I discuss my mental health? Not knowing how the world might respond to them.
Exactly that. And I think it really just comes back to overall acceptance and organisations being aware of some of the adjustments they can make in order to be able to, in the first instance, attract, retain and develop autistic talent in their organisation. So, for us, probably the most frightening statistic of all of the research we did was that there was a huge percentage of respondents that feel the need to hide their autism. So effectively, they aren't able to, or they're not confident to be able to disclose it in the workplace. So that's 42% of everyone that we surveyed. So, it could always be worse. But actually, it's still not good enough, and there's a long way to go.
That's not good, is it? When we're saying only 1 in 5 autistic people is able to get the job, and then half of those guys are really worried about sharing the fact that they're autistic, we are clearly not getting it right here at all. So that's 3 areas you've talked about there. You've talked about reasonable adjustments. You've talked about autistic people being able to advocate for themselves and talk about their mental health and communicate that well with management. And also this thing of, do I even let people know that I'm autistic? Exactly. You know, those are three areas. Let's go over to Pete and Dan. Dan, first, for you, as you're listening into this, is any part of you thinking, yep, are you relating to any of this, or has this not been your experience?
No, like 100%. I mean, a lot of what is being discussed is something that I've come across quite a few times, not only for myself, but also friends of mine who are on the autism spectrum. For instance, there's a friend of mine, Anna, who actually applied for a bunch of jobs. She lives in the West Midlands, and she got 5 job offers. And every time she started working there and then discussed her additional need, for maybe reasonable adjustments, the work suddenly dried up. And so she was left then without a job, which is absolutely unbelievable. I briefed the European Parliament in January of 2020 on this exact thing, saying about how employers, they don't seem autism as being some kind of advantage when we're employing people of neurodiverse brain activity, that they kind of see it as something that's going to be a burden for them, which is a really bizarre narrative that we kind of need to break that mold. But saying that, on a slightly more positive, people like Google and Microsoft are actively hiring autistic people now to work certain things, like Steve was saying, about having a good attention to detail, really clever outside the box thinking, very creative and artsy because of the complex brain mechanisms. And I think showing more of that, it would be great. But I think a lot of the time the mentality of what we see as being autism in the workplace is controlled by how much of the media will actually talk about it in a good light, rather than seeing kind of some fabricated fantasy on some media like entertainment channel, or seeing, the film Rain Man and not really understanding anything about autism. And reasonable adjustments. I think this is probably one of the biggest reasons that autism in the workplace doesn't work. I mean, when I started working, it was really difficult to get the job, because it was difficult in the interview process, because they ask questions and then it becomes ambiguous and you're like, I'm not entirely sure what they're asking, so am I answering the correct question?
Yes.
Or and to stop somebody in an interview and say, sorry, could you say that 6 times in a row, the same thing, it's really difficult. But so that was challenging. But when I actually found a loophole where I went through a work agency, and they'll just take anybody, right? And then they just throw you into different roles. And it's like, IT, yeah, okay, there you go. And I was really lucky in that respect. But the biggest challenge was when you have, I like to have routines of when I eat food and stuff, so when you have your lunch, but when you're in a working environment, sometimes it's kind of ad hoc, and they're like, oh, we're going to work through lunch today, and we're going to do an extra couple of hours, whatever. It's like, it's very difficult to find your bearings with that, and to then say ask for reasonable adjustments. That then they just kind of question, why is this person asking for reasonable adjustments? Only because they have no prior understanding to the condition, which brings full circle on to like what Tim was saying about a lot of companies, I think they just need training on autism. And I think a lot of there needs to be a blanket, maybe even a government scheme, where if you are set up as a legal employer, then it's mandatory to take kind of some training to understand neurodiverse brain types, because, otherwise we're going to be at a loss.
I absolutely hear you on that. Pete, what do you think of some of those findings?
I mean, they're not surprising. Obviously, these are statistical findings that have, as has been mentioned, have been flagged up by the NAS in the past, and they certainly don't surprise me at all as an autistic adult who's been in the workplace. From my point of view, obviously I was in the workplace and now I am not. I am technically self-employed. Everything that I do is off my own back, but it's massively reduced in terms of time and such, like to how my job was in school, which was obviously very intense and very full on, many hours a day. I think that, as I say, it's not surprising, simply because that understanding of autism simply isn't there for the vast majority of workplaces, even for those that are trying their very best to be very, very inclusive and progressive in their attitude towards autism. Because, quite frankly, you can have very good intentions along those lines, but without the true, genuine understanding of what it is that autistic people need, it's not going to get anybody anywhere. It's not. Nobody's going to benefit from that whatsoever. And I think that what we're probably seeing increasingly, in the last few years, is that. We've got workplaces who are willing, who are keen, who want to do the right thing here, but who just simply don't know how to. And that is going to obviously be a problem until we manage to just raise completely the level of understanding and acknowledgement of what it is autistic people genuinely need when they are engaged in work. So yeah, as I say, unsurprising.
I just want to pick up on something Dan said earlier about asking for reasonable adjustments. Tim, for you, at the National Autistic Society, we all understand this phrase, reasonable adjustments. It means making those adjustments that are really not a big deal, that make life doable for autistic people, that make life possible for autistic people to be in all kinds of environments, not just the workplace. This could be school, could be theatre, could be anywhere. What is the difference then, I suppose I'm asking, is, Tim, between someone learning about reasonable adjustments, because some people just don't even know what they are, and working with people who see all reasonable adjustments as being very unreasonable? I almost feel like there's two separate groups here.
I think you're right. And one of the issues actually is something that Dan was touching on, which is it's about understanding. Because fundamentally, if you don't understand autism, if you're then approached about reasonable adjustments, it's more likely that you might think, oh, why on earth do I have to do that? Why do I have to think differently about this thing that we've been doing for decades just because this person finds it difficult, without realizing actually the importance of that. And it might seem really small and minor to you, like being allowed to wear headphones in the office. For some reason, some offices just don't like that. Don't understand it, but actually, for an autistic person, that's a fundamental barrier to access. And I think there's a lack of appreciation, therefore, because you don't really understand autism. That's true. I think it's important not to just sort of tar all employers with the same bad brush. There are loads of good ones out there. And actually, when we spoke to employers a while back, we were asking them, what would be your concerns? And yes, there were some poor attitudes out there, like not thinking that autistic people would be able to function as part of a team, and all of the traditional stereotypes that we all know are absolute rubbish. But there was also a quite big contingent among them who were saying, actually, one of the things that stops me is I'm afraid of getting it wrong. And that means fundamentally there's an information gap. And what we've been saying at the National Autistic Society is that there is a role for government here to fill that information gap, to make sure that there's some kind of a hub of information online that gives employers practical tips about what some of these reasonable adjustments might be, about where employers can go to get extra support, because a lot of employers have never heard of something called Access to Work, the government scheme that can fund some of these more expensive reasonable adjustments. For example, it could be in-depth training for your staff. One of the biggest reasonable adjustments you can make for autistic people is training. But Access to Work is probably one of the government's best kept secrets. They actually want more people to take them up on it, but loads of employers don't know about it. And until they do, I think we're going to see especially smaller employers finding it much harder to tap into that pool of talent of autistic people, because they fundamentally they think it's going to be harder than it actually is, especially financially. And the reality is, as we've already heard, actually, you could be gaining a really committed employee who thinks completely differently about a situation, revolutionizes the way that your business is going to do business, and you'll never look back from it again. But how are you going to get there if you don't even know you can do it in the first place?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Tim. So for you, Steve, at auticon, is this some of the work that you're doing? You're hearing about a government scheme there, Access to Work, but some of your work surely is about helping companies to actually understand what it is they might need to do. Exactly
that. I mean, both Pete and Dan made some really good points there. I mean, it really does start with awareness. And that comes from, it has to come from within. It needs to come from ideally the top or several angles within an organisation. And typically you might see that coming from, the HR perspective or the diversity and inclusion perspective. But actually, training is just that first step. And quite honestly, what we see is, and really what we say is that we are in the fear and mitigation business, to Tim's point earlier. And it is about, trying to make sure that we can take away some of that fear and mitigate the risk. So, when we're actually having those conversations, it is a journey. This isn't about, just providing training or just, providing, our consultants into the workplace. Our social mission is very much at the cornerstone of everything we do. But fundamentally, it is about that long-term education such that ultimately those employers feel confident enough to be able to do everything themselves. It's a bit like learning to swim by reading a book in many ways. It's great, there's some great information, and I compare that to the training. But actually, what we do by placing consultants into client organisations to augment their teams is really about a live experience.
And we also know that those consultants, those autistic consultants, they're all going to be individual. They're going to have different needs and different challenges and different strengths and different gifts and all of those things. I know when my second child started work as an actor on Hollyoaks, it was extraordinary. Line Pictures sent every single member of staff on 2 days training. They were given a creative enabler. They were given their own space. And it was interesting seeing the fact that my child went to work and people around them had had more autism training for Hollyoaks than my child had had of any teacher at school. So somewhere there's a bit of a breakdown in terms of training, and Tim talked about training, but also actually honouring the individual. I know when Tyler, my child, first walked onto set, everyone sort of put their hands behind their back as if to say, it's all right, you don't need to shake hands, you don't need to hug. And Tyler went up and hugged everybody. And and of course they were like, hang on a minute, this wasn't in the autism training. So I think it is about actually understanding that the individual. And for that, you need real life situations.
Absolutely. You can't, you can't substitute that first-hand experience. Ultimately, and then it's by having that first-hand experience, and we're never going to be able to boil the ocean in one go, but you've got to start somewhere. But actually within the teams, and Tim made a great point as well, a lot of these things that we talk about in terms of minor adjustments or reasonable adjustments, they would be hugely beneficial to everyone joining an organisation.
Yes.
There is no differentiation whatsoever.
Yeah, often that is the case. Absolutely. So let's spend a couple of minutes looking at best practice. Has anybody else got a story where you go, actually, that really worked? I saw that at work, or I heard about that, and that really worked. Tim, I'm imagining you must have some good stories of best practice where it's really worked.
Well, I mean, we see so many different examples of actually just the small things that can make a big difference. Some of the examples I've heard over the years, it could be actually just thinking differently about your interview process. Interviews are, let's face it, interviews are weird. They're a really strange situation to put someone in. They're not really a test for the job. There are much better ways you could do it. So some places use work trials. Get that person in for a day, see if they can actually do the job, and then if they can do the job, offer them that job. From a practical point of view, that's probably a much better way of doing it. For other jobs, maybe you do need an interview. And in fact, I was interviewing yesterday for some jobs, and there are some things that you can do in interviews to make them much more autism friendly. So firstly, you can make your questions really clear. We often send ours out a couple of days before, because I'd much rather hear a good answer than someone trying to struggle to figure out actually to interpret what the question means in that situation. So give someone a little bit more time to process.
We're all nodding here. All of us are like, yes. Yeah.
And then I think other things, like just really clearly explain at the beginning what's going to happen in the interview, or tell someone they can take a little bit more time to think it through, to prepare themselves for the answer. Because too often, actually, people just rush because they're really worried about any kind of assumptions that might be made from the fact that I haven't answered the question straight away.
Yeah.
Actually, even online interviews have possibly made it a bit easier sometimes to think. Some employers will think, oh, that person's not really making eye contact with me. Some autistic people will generally find that painful, but the employer will then read into that, this person might not be interested, they're preoccupied. Well, during the pandemic and with doing everything online, we've all been looking slightly off each other's eyes. No one's made direct eye contact, and perhaps it makes removes some of the stress from the situation for some autistic people. They've also not had to make a new journey to a new place. So there are loads of these things that actually potentially over the last couple of years we've got really used to doing day in, day out that we should probably keep. as well. So those are just a few examples. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but I probably ought not to.
Yeah, so the interview process, that's an important one. Dan, for you, has there been anything that you've thought, that really worked for me? I wish everyone would do that.
Yeah, there was a couple of instances in one of the places I last worked at before I was an influencer. Was the employer allowed me to come in, like 10 minutes after the big morning rush at 9 o'clock, and that was really, really helpful. And the same with leaving. I was able to leave just a little bit earlier, or even just hang out in the office until everyone had left, and so that was really, really helpful. And the other major one, which Tim was just talking about then, was the ability to work from home. I had like a really big meltdown in one of the offices that I worked at because they'd moved my desk when I was on holiday, and came back and it was just a big mess. But they allowed me to work from home for a little bit to kind of just, ease back into it because I couldn't come back into the office for a while. And just that alone was just so much. It took almost all of the pressure of doing, because you've got to think you're doing a job, and to do a job, there is stress and pressure with any job. That's why they pay you to do it, right? But then the byproduct is that you have all of this other stuff going on for a neurodivergent brain type. You've got all the lights and sounds and the people and the smells and the timings and and the social conventions. So when you take all of that out of the rubbish away, I was able to concentrate on the job more, and I thought that was just fantastic. And that's why I think that COVID for autistic people was a little bit of a blessing in disguise for the ability to work at home. Because like Tim said, there was no pressure to making eye contact, or you could actually enter a meeting and not sit there sweating for the whole time, thinking, oh my God. So, and that was really good.
Steve, what's your experience of some of the good practice that you've seen across? I mean, you work with so many companies.
So I guess ultimately, Carrie, it's not all doom and gloom, is probably what I say. We are in the muck and bullets. We are in the trenches, pretty much every day. And I think, when we have a consultant that's going to be starting on a project, we actually have an awareness session with that immediate team. And again, to some of Dan's points, what that does is to be very focused on that individual. But actually, it's just about removing that fear and removing the risk. And things happen. There's never a bump-free road, as they say. But I guess ultimately, where we provide a job coach, and that job coach really acts as a bridge between the consultant and the client, that ultimately takes away all of the risk and the fear, because the client, the company has that ability to lean on the job coach, and so they will get things wrong. Things won't go smoothly. We know that, but fundamentally, to have that support ultimately on a daily basis for whether it be 3 months, 6 months, or whatever it means for both the client and the consultant is that living case study. It's that living proof, again, to Tim's point earlier, that these things aren't scary. These are very, very minor things.
And of course, for the person, the autistic person, they can speak to their coach, presumably, and say, this is just not working for me, this is a problem. Or that coach may see things ahead of them going in.
Exactly. And it can be working hours, it can be starting a little bit earlier or finishing a bit later.
Yeah, like Dan said.
Exactly. And I think we see this all the time. And I think as soon as you start, there is almost no going back, because why would you go back? You get on the journey, and I think ultimately that awareness is growing, and it's about that self-perpetuation where hopefully there will be a tipping point in the workplace where that acceptance is widely known.
Yeah. And for you, Pete, what examples have you seen of good practice?
Well, I mean, similar to that, I've seen some really good examples of coaching or mentorship, or simply something a little, even less formal than that, where there is just one person, one member of staff who's neurotypical, who is just the kind of point of call for that autistic employee. So they have someone who's safe to go to, who's not going to be judgmental, who's not necessarily going to, be adding extra reasons to sack this person to their mental list, like how you might feel if you approach your boss, or somebody who might not be quite so understanding. It removes that kind of layer of fear and trepidation as, to do with actually, being open a little bit about how you're feeling and how you're coping and how you're dealing with being in the workplace. But it stretches into recruitment too. Before you even get to that stage, I've seen some fantastic stuff from employers who have really worked hard to try to normalise the atypical in interview situations. You know, basically, frankly, you know, in an interview situation in this country, in this culture, you know, there's expected to be handshakes and eye contact and small talk and all of those little social moments that that kind of lubricate the whole thing. And of course, that goes, you know, that's very difficult for autistic people to negotiate. You know, all of those things are things that we might struggle with quite a lot, especially the eye contact, physical contact, you know, of that handshake. And I think, you know, when you see employers who are aware of this and who do not make snap judgments at an applicant coming in who you know avoids doing those things, who may not be able to maintain eye contact, who doesn't shake the hand, who maybe doesn't involve themselves in the small talk too much, and just accept that. And not question it and not see it as being some kind of very bad sign that person is you know not going to be able to handle this workplace. It's a very small thing, but it's something that I've seen and heard examples of as well. That's just a game changer, really. You know, it just removes that whole layer of another layer of fear from the interview process.
Dan, now I definitely wanted to talk to you about this. Entrepreneurialism is such a great word. We find that I'm speaking in an anecdotal way amongst my autistic community and friends, so many of them have found that they have become entrepreneurs rather than working for someone. It seems to work better for them when they just run their own business, and they're really good at it. I mean, really good at it. So is that something that you have found?
Oh, 100%. You know, my mental health team, which is what autism is currently taken care of here in Wales, is under the mental health team. You know, they were basically like, you know, in order to keep a stable mind and you know, professionalism around me, I could only really work 2 days a week for a company, which was rubbish. You know, like how on earth are you supposed to support yourself on 2 days a week work? It's just, you know, the potential's rubbish. So then I really was in a bit of a tizzy. So I didn't know what to do, and I'd finished my degree, which was I was only able to do a degree because I had disabled student support, which was fantastic. But in terms of going into working life, it was difficult. So then when I started my own kind of like, I really liked visual media and performance art and that kind of stuff. And so by doing more creative types of things, I was able to use the science-y stuff that I got from my degree, like, you know, analyzing data, and I really liked it. And because I really liked it, I could spend as long as I wanted on it because it wasn't damaging for me. It was actually very soothing for me. It was my relaxation time as well as work, you know. So I work all the time. I work from 6 a.m. till about 10, 11 o'clock at night every day. And I love that because my work is something I love. And so with autistic people, if you're, you know, say you love Pokemon cards, maybe you could be like a dictionary on Pokemon cards and collect Pokemon cards and flip them on eBay. And then there's, you know, entrepreneurial kind of avenue, you know, or even make a YouTube channel and discuss Pokemon. And because you're passionate about it, because you understand that, it's going to take flight. The problem we've got in traditional Western kind of capitalism is that you kind of go, oh, I need a job to get money to pay my bills. And you end up going down a route which is completely not suitable to you, you know, especially for neurodivergent individuals who will have difficulties in that kind of like typical environment, versus where if they just had a breathing space to say, okay, what can I offer the world in terms of value, and then do that as a job. So I think entrepreneurship is such a valuable thing. And I believe we're going to see more of it in general in the world now, but more in autistic people, because like they're so much more creative when they're allowed you know, creative freedom to create work and job and potentials, you know. And I think we touched on this before when we were talking about I think Steve was saying about autistic people in IT. You know, you got to look at the people who work for Google and Facebook and creating NFTs and cryptocurrencies, and even Elon Musk, you know, the richest guy in the world. This guy's, you know, and he's on the autism spectrum. So it just proves again how, like, you know, there's so many relevant skills now, but allowing them to become entrepreneurs. And I think maybe a government scheme to help fund entrepreneurship within autism small businesses would be a great thing.
Thank you, Dan. And for you, Peter, you come from an education background. What could and or should be done better in the school environment to improve long-term employment for autistic people?
Well, I think in schools there's a almost unique level of pressure that you tend to get in a school environment that I think needs to be addressed if autistic teachers, who by all accounts, and I'm speaking from just my experience of knowing an awful lot of autistic teachers, are excellent at what they do. The passion for the subject and the clarity with which we explain what we need to be teaching, it is really there. So it's very important that we're kept in the classroom, but because of that tremendous amount of pressure and stress, and kind of real time pressure that is squeezing us all of the time, that there has to be some mitigation of that somewhere, because otherwise what happens is we will just burn out. I mean, the biggest thing really for a teacher is the fact that you're up in front of people for the vast majority of the day, having to be very, very social. It's a very social job. Even if you're quite a quiet teacher, or a teacher who doesn't indulge too much in chatting with the students, getting to know them, it's still you're forward facing, you've got 30 people in the room looking at you, you're having to engage with them, you're trying to cajole them to do things. It's tremendously intensive, and you find yourself spending probably 90 to 95% of your time masking. That autistic trait where we just basically shut down all of our autistic traits in order to try to be as neurotypical as we can be, which comes at enormous cost, in terms of energy and kind of long-term health. So I think there has to be a trade-off there with probably the biggest thing being face-to-face time. The average secondary school teacher only has probably about, I can't remember now, it's been a year or so since I was in the classroom, but around 5 free periods a fortnight. You're in front of classes for the vast majority of the time, and I think that in itself is quite difficult for an autistic teacher. I think that if one thing could help, it would be to just reduce slightly that contact time, a little bit more what we call PPA, planning and preparation time, marking time as well, just in order to make the job that little bit more achievable. Because the alternative is that you get generations of excellent autistic teachers just burning out and having to walk away. And I say that from that's very personal to me, because that's exactly what happened to me. I think I was a very good teacher. I like to think so, but it got to the point where if I were to carry on, it would have completely trashed my health. So I had to take the step away and rely on other skills. So that would be a really big thing for me. It's also sadly one of the things that's probably less likely to happen unless more is made of it and more awareness is made of that need. And then of course you've got the children themselves who are there in order to learn how to enter the workforce. Well, that's one thing that they're there for, in order to make money and to enjoy their lives and to progress. And obviously, I think that at the moment for autistic children, unless they're very, very lucky, and they have teachers or support staff who know autism tremendously well, there is no kind of formalised, here is how you specifically are probably going to struggle with getting employment, so here's what you need to do in order to kind of manage it. There's none of that. I certainly don't remember anything like that happening when I was at school, and certainly not when I was a teacher either. Autistic students, especially those who are able to just get on with their work normally for the majority of the time, are just kind of left to it, and they do their A-levels, off they go to either university or employment, and there's no formalized or even slightly informal input into actually I can tell you, with some honesty, you are going to struggle with X, Y, and Z aspects of the job market. So here is how to survive it. There's none of that. And to be honest, if I can imagine anything at all that would have helped me at that stage, if somebody had just taken me to one side and said, Pete, you're autistic. I mean, we didn't know that then, but imagine that they did. You're autistic, you are likely to find this aspect of interviews difficult. You're likely to find this aspect of the job difficult. We know that your organisational skills are a little bit poor, let's just say. So here's how to mitigate that and try to move beyond that and make the best of it. That would have been a life changer. It really would have been. I would have made such better decisions and had much better outcomes, I think, from the age of 18 onwards, if that had been in place. And all it would take is for a well-trained, somebody who knows plenty about autism on the staff, Senko, just a teacher, whoever, just to have, just some sessions, like some mentoring sessions, maybe during, year 11, last year of GCSE, or maybe at A level, if that's at that school. And the difference would be absolutely gigantic, I think. And it's, relatively easy to put into place, I would say.
Okay, guys, I'm going to finish up with a little bit of a hopeful section. What are your hopes for the future? Is it all doom and gloom, or do you think there are breakthroughs around the corner? Let's go to you first, Tim.
My hopes for the future is that I can stop saying the words autism employment gap, because it just shouldn't happen. I think what I want to see, therefore, is the government committing to closing the autism employment gap and really acknowledging that actually it's much wider than for disabled people more generally, and that there are things that they're going to have to do fundamentally a bit differently in order to reach autistic people. I think that means there's got to be a few different things. So one is all the work support programs that help people to get into work. They don't seem to work very well for most autistic people at the moment. There's not enough autism specialism within them. They need to work with people who have that specialist knowledge, including people like auticon, people like the National Autistic Society, autistic people themselves, to inject that specialism into them and make sure that every autistic person, when they go to the job centre or any kinds of careers advice, gets that right kind of autism-specific advice. I think we also need to make sure that people are given the information to explore exactly those things that Dan was just saying about self-employment opportunities. Self-employment can be quite scary because you've got to do all your own taxes, sort out all your own information and stuff like that. And actually, there's not a lot of accessible information out there to explain how to do that, to stay legal and in compliance with all those regulations that you have to do. So if we really want autistic people to be entrepreneurial, well, then we need to support them to be able to do that. And then finally, I think we need to make sure that there's lots of information out there for employers. This is something I mentioned earlier on, that online information, pointing people to where they need to go, and making sure that no longer do we have the excuse of employers saying, oh, I don't really understand what a reasonable adjustment for autistic people would mean. They know instantly, I'm going to ask this person, what are the reasonable adjustments you need, and I'm going to plan out a way to meet them in the workplace. Underlying all that, we need to see a fundamental shift in public attitudes. We can try and tackle just employer attitudes if we like, but unless we change the whole of society's attitudes through better representation in media, through sort of communities understanding more about what it means to be autistic and how you can help autistic people, then we'll start to see that drip through to employment and all other spheres as well.
Thank you so much for that, Tim. How about for you, Peter? Where's your hope?
Well, I mean, very similar for me, really. Just a general society-wide rising of understanding. We talk about autism awareness. You know, that's what the month is called every April. You know, Autistic Awareness Month, and every year the autistic community, you know, of which I am a part, you know, we make a bit of a fuss, really, quite a reasonable fuss, about how we don't really want people to be aware of us. We want people to accept us. You know, that's the thing that really makes the difference. You know, being aware of something is great, but it doesn't mean you actually have to do anything about it. It's just like, oh, there's an autistic person. How fun. You know, accepting is looking at an autistic person, talking to an autistic person, and being okay with who they are. Being okay with the fact that they might behave slightly differently to how you might expect a person to behave. And that is where the real change is going to happen, I think. You know, when you see neurotypical people seeing somebody in the street who is autistic, they might not know they're autistic, but, you know, and they're stimming. You know, they're doing those repetitive movements that we do to keep ourselves calm. And their first thought is, oh, I wonder if they're autistic. That looks like they're stimming. And that's it. You know, rather than, for example, oh, I want to keep away from them. That looks strange and unusual and I don't like that. You know, just that would be a sea change beyond pretty much anything else. And yeah, that would trickle down then into employment, you know, quite rapidly, I would imagine. And yeah, I think, you know, it feels a long way off, but you've got to hope, haven't you? You've got to look forward to something being much better than it is currently. So yeah, a full, widespread acceptance of the autistic community, the way that we are, the way that we act, the way that we speak, the things that we speak about. That would be the thing that I'm hoping for the most.
Thank you, Peter. Steve is the sort of pro in here. Steve, do you feel there's real hope for our autism community?
Absolutely. I think, you know, everything, just the fact that we are all together on this on this show, for one, is a testimony to the fact that we all want the same thing. And if you take a normal commercial example of trying to get, business people and, policymakers in a room together, that's really difficult. But actually, by us having the conversation and being able to promote, the messages of awareness and, education and some of the things that both Tim and Dan were talking about, that's got to be fantastic in its own right. And I think, ultimately we all kind of leave here and we go off into our own separate sort of channels. But ultimately, we're not competing. We're all doing this for the same benefit. Ultimately, yes, it's going to take time. Yes, there's elements of policy. There's elements of what we can do and what media can do. But I think ultimately, it is a very positive message. Absolutely.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Steve. And Dan, let's go to you. What are your hopes?
I talk a lot about like my hopes for the future, right? When I do a lot of like talks and stuff, and often some of the times when I'm doing a talks for the autism show in the UK, which is a great show. I don't know if Tim's ever been to those, but they're great, Tim. If you should totally
great.
go to one.
I've been there. They're really good, aren't they?
they're great, and I'm looking forward to the world opening back up so we can get back to doing the in-person ones. And when I'm on the stage and stuff, I always get parents ask me like, they ask me the question, I'm worried for my kid. What's going to happen for the future for my kid? And I said the only thing they really need to kind of push, and the only hope that I have, is that the kid or the autistic person realizes their actual full potential and not have that tarnished by the things that they can't do. So I don't say, so I say to the people, look, if your kid's really good at Lego or gaming, then push it. Get them to really see their value. And that's my hope, because autistic people look at the world too often and say, I can't do that. I'm a person who can't do, not that I'm a person who can do. Kind of like when I wake up in the morning and I go, I'm not a cordon bleu chef. Well, I'm never going to be a chef. I don't worry about it. You know what I mean? So I kind of say to them, don't worry about, if you can't do something, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It just means that you're good at something else. And so my hope is that autistic people will, in the future and from now on, just kind of look at themselves as the value they can offer rather than the things they can't do. I hope that kind of makes sense.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our guests today. That's Steve Hill, Tim Nichols, Dan Jones and Peter Wharmby. What I've really heard today is we've looked at the barriers. We've looked at some of the potential solutions. And I just want to finish with something really that Dan touched on, which is, that conversation with that parent. Where is the asset? Sitting in that child, sitting in that young person, there are assets. And this is the stuff that we need to be helping the child to develop, helping the parent to see, and helping employers to understand that our autistic community have great assets that are totally usable if they will work with us. Thank you so much for listening. We really hope you enjoyed this episode of Autism in Conversation with Auticon. Just to mention, in terms of a community preference language, all episodes in this series were recorded in November 2021. We did our recording and production at the Strathmore Studios in Clerkenwell, London. It was engineered and edited by Billy Godfrey. Music was by the Lethargies. If you'd like to know more about the next show or would like further information about how Auticon can help, please visit www.auticon.co.uk. That's all from us this time. Bye for now.